I'll be reading from Jeremiah chapter 38, verses 7 through 13. Now Ebed-melech the Ethiopian, one of the eunuchs who was in the king's house, heard that they had put Jeremiah in the dungeon. When the king was sitting at the gate of Benjamin, Ebed-melech went out to the king's house and spoke to the king, saying, My lord the king, these men have done evil in all that they have done to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they cast into the dungeon, and he is likely to die from hunger in this place where he is, for there is no more bread in the city. Then the king commanded Ebed-melech the Ethiopian, saying, Take from here 30 men with you, and lift Jeremiah the prophet out of the dungeon before he dies. So Ebed-melech took the men with him and went into the house of the king under the treasury, and took from there old clothes and old rags, and let them down by ropes into the dungeon to Jeremiah. Then Ebed-melech the Ethiopian said to Jeremiah, Please put these old clothes and rags under your armpits, under the ropes. And Jeremiah did so. So they pulled Jeremiah up with the ropes and lifted him out of the dungeon, and Jeremiah remained in the court of the prison.
Be seated, please. You obviously probably know that there is an Ethiopian eunuch mentioned in Acts chapter 8, where Philip was called by the Holy Spirit to go out into the desert place, and there he had a confrontation, a very good one, with an Ethiopian eunuch who's on his way home from worshiping in Jerusalem. You may not have known that there's another one. And the background of the text that Kurt just read a moment ago was a rather interesting one, explaining the situation about this other Ethiopian eunuch by the name of Ebed-melech. Here's the deal. Babylon is besieging Jerusalem. The reason they're besieging Jerusalem is because God's people, the nation of Judah, have, like their counterparts, Israel, decided to disobey God. Chapter 37, the very first verse is there, that Zedekiah the son of Josiah, whom Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon made king in the land of Judah, reigned instead of Coniah the son of Jehoiakim, but neither he nor his servants nor the people of the land listened to the word of the Lord that he spoke through Jeremiah the prophet. They were receiving just due for their lack of respect for God. But during the time of chapter 37, there's a period of time where Babylon had been besieging Jerusalem, getting ready to fight the final fight and to besiege and overtake the city. But evidently, the people had made a deal with Pharaoh from Egypt. And so they hear that Pharaoh and his armies marching from Egypt to help the folks in Jerusalem. And therefore, for a period of time, then Babylon withdraws and sort of, as it were, gets out of the way. It's at this time that Jeremiah then talks to the king. And basically, he tells the king, do not take hope or gain confidence in the fact that Pharaoh and his army is going to help you. In fact, they're going to turn around and go back to God or go back to Egypt. And God's going to still have his final say and his final way. You are going to be taken over by the Babylonians. Well, for that reason then, because he was prophesying that which they did not want to hear, Jeremiah is taken over by certain people of the day, and he's captured and thrown into a cistern or a dungeon, I think the translation that Kurt was reading from, and was treated as a traitor. And it's during this time in chapter 37 and then in chapter 38 that Ebed-melech beseeches the king, let me go and let me get Jeremiah out of that cistern, because if not, he will surely die. It's hard for us to imagine what it must have been like for this Ethiopian, for Jeremiah, for anybody that was trying to do that which was right and godly, to try to perform their duties before God in such a godless and such a terrible situation. But I want us to mention from this, what seems like a rather simple story or narrative, a few lessons that I think that we can learn from this particular Ethiopian eunuch. The first one I think is very evident. He understood, Ebed-Melech, that there was a difference of that which was right that he needed to do and that which was wrong that the people of God were so doing. About 700 years before the time of Christ, Isaiah the prophet would prophesy, "Woe to those who call evil good and who call good evil. Woe to those who put darkness for light and light for darkness. Woe to those who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." In other words, in Jeremiah's day, God's people had gotten so far away from God and so far away from righteous living before God that which was evil was now looked upon as being good. And that which was right and good according to God was seen as that which is evil. I've always wondered when Isaiah said those words, I know likely he was referring to the time of the first century world. But would it be possible that Isaiah was prophesying about the 21st century world in which you and I live? Think for me for just a moment. Today, that which is right is now called wrong, and that which is wrong is seen as that which is right. For example, Proverbs chapter 6, verse 17. God hates, among those 7 things, haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and then he adds, and hands that shed innocent blood. Who would have ever thought in the land of the brave and the home of the free that we would have had in state legislatures and also before the Senate just a few months ago individuals that were trying to ratify a situation in which not only abortion at certain months, but ultimately even asking the question, what if the mother has the child and then decides that she does not want the child? Could they literally go in and kill that child now that it's outside the womb? And there were so many that were saying yes. How sickening, how frightening, how terrifying that we live in a world today. Millions of babies aborted, destroyed in the womb, simply because it was a mother's choice that such would happen. We live in a world today where adultery and fornication is just looked at as just being commonplace. Well, it's living with or loving whoever you want to love. There's nothing wrong with it at all. And yet Christ would remind us in Matthew chapter 5 that you're not to commit adultery. In fact, you're not even to look upon a woman as if you would commit adultery, because if you have done so, then you've done so already in your heart. And then when it comes to divorce, as he amplifies in Matthew chapter 19, 1 through 9, someone that would be willing to divorce for any reason at all has committed adultery, with the exception of that guilty party that has committed adultery or fornication already. And that the individual is free, the other person is free then to remarry. Today, no one thinks about marriage. No one thinks about the sanctity of that relationship that one makes, yes, between a married and an individual for the rest of their life, before a judge or in some kind of legal way, but most importantly, before God. And by the time that Malachi writes what we would call, according to our order, the last book of the Old Testament, that's where God says God hates divorce, but you folks have made a mockery of the marriage relationship. We live in a world today where God calls that which is abomination, many will call gay. Romans chapter 1, as Paul writes to those Roman brethren, reminding them, yes, you're in the very capital city of paganism, but immorality as well. Here's what man has done. And it's rather interesting if you go back and dissect those verses. Yes, God gave them up to those unnatural affections of man with men and women with women, but it goes back to verse 17. When they chose to be unrighteous, when they chose not to follow God, that's when they invented for themselves some other idea, some pagan, immoral idea of relationships with men and women with women. We live in a world today where false doctrine is called Christian liberty. We have the freedom in Christ to agree to disagree. Yeah, matters of opinion, but not in matters of doctrine. John writes, probably next to Revelation, one of the last books of the Bible, historically speaking. Listen to what he has to say. For many deceivers, verse 7, have gone into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus in the flesh. Such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Watch yourselves, so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win a full reward. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, that is, this teaching that Jesus has come in the flesh and that he lived and died and went to heaven, do not receive him to your house or give him any greeting, for whoever greets him takes part in his evil or wicked works. Pretty plain, isn't it? It's not Christian freedom. It's false doctrine. And we need to understand today that we live in a world that is so very evil. And I'm afraid instead of it getting better, it will get worse. This past Monday evening, Bonnie and I were privileged to be in another place in another part of the state, or another part of we went to Tennessee. Keep saying. We're at an occasion honoring ministers of the gospel of longevity. One of the speakers, as well as one of the honorees, is a member of the House of Representatives of the state of Tennessee. I wish you had heard his words. Likely you can go on to the Memphis School of Preaching website and you can probably hear what the representative, Brother John Dewberry, said. It was powerful, but it was also scary. Because he told, particularly the young preachers there at that school, he said, I've seen the hatred in the hallways. I felt and listened to the speeches that are being made in our state House of Representatives. I've seen the way the people have gone in regard to their thinking about religious freedom and justice and that which is right. And then he said something like this: preacher boys, you ministers of the gospel, you need to watch out because they're coming to get you. He said those individuals of liberalism, those individuals of immorality, those individuals who do not want God and His Word to be respected and adhered to in this country and even within our state. He used this phraseology. They are sharpening their teeth as wolves, and they're coming to get you. Be aware. Be courageous. Preach the word. Ebed-Melech did what was right instead of what so many others were doing that was wrong. But he also had concern for somebody else in need, besides being in perhaps a precarious situation himself. No doubt he practiced the principle. You love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, but you also love your neighbor as yourself, Jesus said in Matthew 22. Or as Paul would later on say, you love someone with brotherly affection, like that of a family member. Or as Paul said in Philippians chapter 2, don't just get caught up with your own thoughts and your own needs and your own concerns, but go outside of yourself and look to the needs of others. And that's exactly what Ebed-Melech did. Can you imagine the courage it must have gone before the king and said, King, look, if we don't go do something now to rescue Jeremiah, he's going to die in that dungeon, in that cistern. There's no bread in the city. We've got to do something to protect him, to help him. And that concern led to action. In fact, it goes that he went to the storehouse and they got old clothes and rags and they started tying them together and, as it were, made a homemade rope so they could let it down and for him to put it over his arms. And they pulled him up out of that muddy cistern. His concern led to action. You ever thought about why the parable of the Good Samaritan is such a great one that even non-religious people admire the idea of that understanding? In fact, there are Good Samaritan laws mentioned in our country, in cities and in states for a very good reason. Because someone would go out of their way to care for somebody else. The priest, the Levite were too busy. He got out off his donkey. He bounded his wounds with oil and wine. He put him on the donkey, carried him to the inn, took care of him all night long, gave money to the innkeeper. Whatever it costs, take care of him. I'll pay you when I get back again. He went out of his way. Remember Acts chapter 3? I've always wondered why Acts 3 is found after the great chapter of Acts chapter 2. There's a reason. Because Peter and John wanted to show that Christianity is nothing unless it's Christianity in love that sees to the needs of another individual. And thus they healed that man that everybody knew had been there as a beggar for years and years and years because he could not walk. And they took care of him. And it caused all kinds of issues for Peter and John, both then in chapter 4 of Acts and for all of the apostles in chapter 5. But you see, that's exactly what love is. Love is something that is done in action. That's why James gives us the admonition in James chapter 1. Look, don't just love in word only. You're not just to be doers of the word, you're to be hearers. And you're not to be just hearers of the word, but to be doers of the word. And that's what he talks about. There's no way that one can say that faith is just simply a belief. It's a belief that leads us to do something. And thus, as James gives us the example in chapter 2. Listen to him. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith, but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed or lacking in daily food, and one of you says to him, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving him the things necessary or needful for the body, what good is that? So faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Now, this Ethiopian eunuch did not, perhaps, as Acts chapter 8 would suggest, go out as he left after being with Philip, being baptized by him. He went on his way rejoicing. I'm sure this particular Ethiopian didn't rejoice because of what he was doing, but he was glad that he did it, because he did the right thing. And his concern led him to think about someone else just besides himself, and it led to action. You ever thought, what about Jeremiah? What would have happened to him? And if you read between the lines, you sort of get the idea. The king was sort of clueless as to what to do for Jeremiah. There were some strong, opinionated individuals with evidently some power that had taken him and thrown him into that cistern in that dungeon. And the king said, I can't do anything about it. He would have died there if it had not been for Abimelech. Today in our world, where so many scream, me, myself, and I, we've got to do something with courage and with faith and with conviction. Look around those who are in their cisterns. Look around those who are in their dungeons. And go out practicing the golden rule and pray that God will receive the glory for the good that you do. Every single day, including today, but tomorrow when you go out into the world, you will find someone burdened, someone troubled, someone that does not know which way to go. Do something good for God. And be the kind of Christian that God wants and expects us to be. If you want to respond to the Lord's invitation publicly, we invite you to come right now. It's good we stand and sing the invitation song.